27 years of marriage ended on a Tuesday morning in October, and I buried my husband Richard on the rainiest Thursday our small town of Millbrook had seen in decades. But what happened 3 days later at my sister's house would make me question everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the people we trust most in this world. Before I dive into this story that changed my life forever, I want you to comment below and let me know where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you proves that betrayal knows no borders, and the most devastating lies often come from the people closest to home. My name is Margaret Chin. I'm 63 years old, and if you've ever felt like the ground beneath your feet was about to give way, if you've ever discovered that your entire life was built on someone else's deception, then you'll understand every word of what I'm about to tell you. Richard died of a massive heart attack at 58. No warning. No goodbye, just there one moment and gone the next. We were having our morning coffee. He was reading the sports section, complaining about the Cubs' pitching rotation like he did every October, when he suddenly gripped his chest, looked at me with these wide, confused eyes, and said my name one last time before collapsing onto our kitchen floor. The paramedics worked on him for 43 minutes. I counted every second. I stood in that doorway, still wearing my yellow robe with a coffee stain on the sleeve, watching strangers pump his chest and shock his heart, willing him to come back to me. But some goodbyes, you don't get to say them. The funeral was everything Richard would have hated. Too many flowers, too many people crying, too much attention focused on him. He was a quiet man, my Richard. Worked as a mechanical engineer for 32 years, paid his taxes, mowed the lawn every Saturday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, and never once forgot our anniversary. He wasn't flashy or dramatic, but he was steady. God, he was so steady. I remember standing at the graveside, listening to Pastor Williams read from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for everything, and thinking how wrong that felt. There wasn't supposed to be a time for Richard to die at 58. There wasn't supposed to be a time for me to stand alone in the rain, throwing dirt onto the casket of the only man I'd ever loved. My sister Claire stood beside me that day, holding my arm when my knees threatened to buckle. She was 49 then, 8 years younger than me, and she'd always been the dramatic one in our family. Where I was practical and reserved, Claire was passionate and impulsive. Where I married my college sweetheart and stayed in our hometown, Claire had moved to Chicago, then Denver, then back to Chicago, collecting failed relationships like some people collect stamps. She'd moved back to Millbrook 2 years earlier with her son Danny, who was turning 1 that weekend. Single mother, she'd told everyone. Never married the father. The guy was a loser, she said, wanted nothing to do with the baby. Better off without him. I'd helped her find an apartment, had even co-signed her lease because her credit was shot from all those years of instability. Standing there in the rain, watching them lower my husband into the ground, I felt grateful for Claire's presence. She was family. She was all I had left now that Richard was gone. When she squeezed my arm and whispered that everything would be okay, that she'd help me through this, I believed her completely. The reception was held at our house afterward. Our beautiful colonial on Maple Street, the one Richard and I had bought 22 years ago when we finally gave up on having children and decided to pour our love into creating a home instead. People filled our living room and kitchen, eating the casseroles and desserts that neighbors had been dropping off all week, sharing memories of Richard that made me smile even through my tears. Claire helped coordinate everything. She organized the food, made sure people had places to sit, even helped me greet the endless stream of well-wishers who needed to hug me and tell me how sorry they were for my loss. She was so good that day, so present and helpful. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have a sister who would drop everything to help me through the worst day of my life. People started leaving around 7 o'clock, and by 8:30 it was just Claire, baby Danny, and me sitting in my kitchen surrounded by empty casserole dishes and wilted flower arrangements. Danny was fussing in his high chair. He was teething, Claire explained, and she was bouncing him on her lap while I sat at the same table where Richard had died just 4 days earlier. We talked about practical things. The life insurance policy, the mortgage that was thankfully paid off, what I planned to do with all of Richard's clothes and tools. Claire offered to help me go through everything, said I shouldn't have to face all those memories alone. Again, I felt so grateful. Here was my sister, putting her own life on hold to take care of me when I could barely function. She stayed until almost 10 that night, helping me load the dishwasher and put away all the leftover food. Before she left, she hugged me tight and said she'd call me the next day to check on me. She was hosting Danny's first birthday party that Sunday. Just a small family gathering, she said, and she hoped I'd feel up to coming. It would be good for me to get out of the house, to focus on something happy for a change. I told her I wasn't sure I was ready for a party, even a small one. The thought of pretending to be celebratory when my whole world had just collapsed felt impossible. But Claire insisted. She said Danny loved his Aunt Maggie, that it wouldn't be the same without me there. She said Richard would want me to be there for family milestones, that he'd want me to keep living. That night, alone in our big house for the first time since Richard died, I walked through rooms that still smelled like him. His coffee, his aftershave, the particular scent of his skin that I'd been breathing in for 27 years. I sat on his side of our bed and held one of his shirts against my face, trying to memorize everything about him before it faded away. I thought about Claire's invitation to Danny's party. Maybe she was right. Maybe getting out of the house, focusing on new life instead of death, would be good for me. Danny was an adorable baby, chubby cheeks, bright blue eyes, always smiling. He looked nothing like Claire, who had dark hair and brown eyes like me. People always commented on how different he looked from his mother, how he must take after his father. Claire would just shrug and change the subject whenever anyone brought it up. That Friday, I decided I would go to the party. It was the least I could do for my sister, who had been so supportive. I even drove to the store and bought Danny a little stuffed elephant because I remembered Claire mentioning that he loved animals. I wrapped it in bright yellow paper with a blue ribbon, thinking how much Richard would have enjoyed watching his nephew open presents. Saturday night, I could barely sleep. I kept waking up reaching for Richard, forgetting for those first few seconds that he was gone. Each time reality crashed over me again, the grief felt fresh and raw, like someone was tearing open my chest with their bare hands. I kept thinking about how different everything was going to be now. How quiet the house would be without Richard's morning routine, without his voice calling my name from the basement workshop, without his terrible dad jokes that made me roll my eyes and laugh at the same time. I had no idea, lying there in the dark that Saturday night, that my grief was about to become the least of my problems. I had no idea that the next day would shatter not just my understanding of my marriage, but my entire sense of who I could trust in this world. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. October in Illinois can be unpredictable, but that day was crisp and beautiful, the kind of day that makes you want to believe in new beginnings. I got dressed carefully, black pants and a soft gray sweater that Richard had always said brought out my eyes. I wanted to look put together for Danny's party, wanted to honor Claire's effort to bring some joy into our family during such a dark time. I drove to Claire's apartment complex on the other side of town, the gift-wrapped elephant on my passenger seat. The parking lot was nearly empty. Claire had said it would be a small gathering, just us and maybe a couple of her friends from work. I remember checking my reflection in the rearview mirror, practicing a smile that might look genuine enough to get me through a toddler's birthday party. I had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, that smile would become the most important performance of my life. Walking up to Claire's second-floor apartment, I could hear Danny's delighted squeals through the thin walls. Despite everything, the sound made me smile genuinely for the first time since Richard died. There's something about a baby's laughter that cuts through even the deepest grief, even if just for a moment. Claire opened the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching for me. She looked radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years. Bright red dress, her hair done up in soft curls, makeup perfectly applied. She was practically glowing with excitement, which seemed appropriate for a mother celebrating her son's first birthday. The apartment was decorated with balloons and streamers, all in blue and white. A small stack of presents sat on her coffee table, and the smell of vanilla cake drifted from the kitchen. Everything looked perfect, like something out of a parenting magazine. Claire had always been good at creating beautiful moments, even when her life was falling apart in other ways. Danny was sitting in his playpen, surrounded by toys, wearing a little sailor outfit that made him look absolutely precious. When he saw me, He reached up with both chubby arms, making those sweet babbling sounds that babies make when they want attention. I couldn't help but smile as I picked him up, feeling his solid little body against my chest, breathing in that wonderful baby scent that somehow makes everything else fade away for a moment. But here's the thing that struck me as odd. Even then, Danny's eyes weren't just blue like I'd remembered. They were this very specific shade of crystal blue, almost gray in certain light. And looking at him up close, I noticed other details I'd somehow missed before. The shape of his nose, the way his mouth curved when he smiled, even the way he tilted his head when he was concentrating on something. There was something familiar about all of it, but I couldn't quite place what it was. Grief has a way of making your mind fuzzy, so I chalked it up to the emotional fog I'd been living in since Richard's death. Claire took Danny from me and settled him in his high chair with a piece of banana to keep him busy. She was chattering excitedly about the party, how she'd stayed up until midnight making his cake from scratch, how she'd invited a few people from work, but they'd had to cancel at the last minute. It would just be the three of us, she said, which was probably better anyway. More intimate, more special. She poured me a glass of white wine, even though it was barely noon. I usually wouldn't drink so early, but I figured if there was ever a time to bend my own rules, it was in the week after burying my husband. The wine was crisp and cold, and it did help settle some of the anxious energy that had been churning in my stomach since I'd woken up. We talked about normal things while Danny played with his food and babbled happily. Claire asked how I was sleeping, whether I'd given any thought to going back to work. I'd been a librarian at the elementary school for 15 years, and they'd given me indefinite bereavement leave. The idea of facing rooms full of children and their innocent questions about where Mr. Richard was felt impossible, but I knew I'd have to figure it out eventually. Claire was being so thoughtful, so attentive to my needs. She kept refilling my wine glass and making sure I was comfortable, asking if the music was too loud, if I was warm enough, if I needed anything to eat. It was the kind of care you'd expect from a loving sister, and it made me feel guilty for all the times over the years when I'd been impatient with her drama, her chaos, her tendency to create problems where none existed. After lunch, we did the traditional birthday cake routine. Claire had made a beautiful vanilla cake with white frosting and blue decorations, a little sailboat on top to match Danny's outfit. We sang, "Happy Birthday," while Danny clapped his hands and grinned, his face already smeared with banana. When Claire set the cake in front of him, he immediately grabbed a handful of frosting and shoved it in his mouth, getting it all over his cheeks and chin. I found myself laughing, really laughing for the first time since the funeral. There was something so purely joyful about watching this little boy experience his first birthday cake, so innocent and uncomplicated. For those few minutes, the weight of my grief lifted just enough for me to remember what happiness felt like. Claire was taking pictures with her phone, capturing every messy moment. She asked me to get in some of the shots, saying Danny needed pictures with his favorite aunt. I protested that I looked terrible. My eyes were still swollen from crying, and I'd lost 10 pounds in the past week from barely eating. But she insisted, pulling me into frame beside Danny's high chair. Looking back now, I realized she was very deliberate about those photos. She made sure to get several shots of the three of us together, always making sure Danny was prominently featured between us. At the time, I thought she was just being a proud mom, wanting to document her son's milestone. Now I understand she was building a record, creating evidence for something I couldn't have imagined. After the cake disaster, Claire gave Danny a bath while I cleaned up the kitchen. It felt good to have something useful to do with my hands, something that required focus but not too much emotional energy. I was loading the dishwasher when I heard Claire call my name from the bathroom. She was wrapping Danny in a towel, his hair damp and curling around his ears. Clean and sleepy from all the excitement, he looked even more like whoever his father was. The resemblance was really striking now that I was paying attention. He had such distinct features for a baby, such a specific look that clearly came from somewhere. Claire asked if I wanted to help her get Danny dressed for his nap, and I said yes. She led me into the nursery, which she decorated in soft blues and greens with little elephants, coincidentally matching the stuffed elephant I'd brought him. As she laid him on the changing table and started putting him into fresh clothes, she began talking about his father for the first time since Danny was born. She'd been so secretive about it before, always changing the subject or giving vague non-answers when anyone asked. But now, suddenly, she seemed ready to open up. Maybe it was the wine, or the emotional intensity of the day, or just the fact that we'd grown closer since Richard's death. Whatever the reason, she started telling me things she'd never shared before. His father was older, she said. A really good man, the kind of man she'd always dreamed of being with. He was successful, stable, everything she'd thought she wanted. But the timing was all wrong. He was married, she explained, in a complicated situation that made any kind of relationship impossible. When she got pregnant, she knew she had to handle it alone. She couldn't destroy his life, couldn't break up his marriage, couldn't put him in that position. I felt a surge of sympathy for my sister, imagining how difficult it must have been to carry that secret alone. To raise Danny without any support from his father, to field all those questions from family and friends about who the father was, to make up stories about some fictional deadbeat who'd abandoned them both. At the same time, I felt a flash of judgment that I tried to suppress. Claire had always been impulsive when it came to men, always falling for guys who were wrong for her in obvious ways. Getting involved with a married man was exactly the kind of self-destructive choice she'd made before. But looking at Danny, so perfect and innocent, I couldn't bring myself to criticize the situation that had brought him into the world. Claire finished dressing him and lifted him from the changing table, holding him close against her shoulder. He was fighting sleep, his little fists rubbing at his eyes, making those soft whimpering sounds that tired babies make. She swayed back and forth, humming quietly, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Envy, maybe, for the way motherhood had changed her, made her more grounded and purposeful than I'd ever seen her. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said something that should have been a warning, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. She said she was sorry I'd never gotten to experience this, never gotten to hold my own baby, never gotten to feel this kind of love. She knew how much Richard and I had wanted children, how hard it had been when the doctors told us it wasn't going to happen. The comment stung, even though I knew she meant it kindly. It was still a raw wound, even after all these years. Richard and I had tried for 8 years before we finally accepted that parenthood wasn't in our cards. We'd grieved that loss deeply, together, and eventually found other ways to pour our love into the world. But sitting in that nursery, watching Claire with her son, the old ache came flooding back. I told her I was happy for her, that Danny was lucky to have such a devoted mother. She smiled and said she hoped his father would be able to be part of his life someday, when the time was right, when his situation changed. She said Danny deserved to know his father, deserved to have that relationship, that connection to the other half of his identity. Something about the way she said it made me curious. There was an intensity in her voice, a certainty that seemed to suggest she knew more about the father's future plans than she'd let on. But before I could ask any questions, Danny finally succumbed to sleep, his body going limp against her shoulder. She carried him to his crib and laid him down gently, covering him with a soft blue blanket. We tiptoed out of the nursery and back into the living room, where the afternoon light was starting to fade through the windows. Claire poured herself another glass of wine and refreshed mine, even though I was already feeling a little lightheaded from the alcohol and the emotional exhaustion of the day. She sat down beside me on the couch and took my hand in both of hers. Her expression had changed, become more serious, more focused. She said there was something important she needed to tell me, something she'd been wrestling with since Richard's funeral. She'd been waiting for the right moment, she said. And now that we were alone, now that we'd had this beautiful day celebrating Danny, she felt like she could finally be honest about everything. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't have said why. There was something in her tone, something in the way she was looking at me, that made my instincts prickle with unease. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me suspicious of everything and everyone. Claire squeezed my hand and said she loved me, that I'd always been the best big sister anyone could ask for. She said what she was about to tell me was going to be difficult to hear, but that I deserved to know the truth. She said she'd been protecting me, but now that Richard was gone, there was no point in keeping secrets anymore. I asked her what she was talking about, What kind of secrets? My mouth felt dry despite the wine, and my stomach was starting to churn with a kind of dread I couldn't name. Claire took a deep breath, looked toward the nursery where Danny was sleeping, and then looked back at me with something that might have been pity in her eyes. She said she was sorry, so very sorry, but that Richard was Danny's father. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire, impossible to ignore, toxic to breathe in. For a moment, my brain simply refused to process what Claire had just said. It was like trying to solve a math problem where all the numbers had suddenly turned into foreign symbols. Richard was Danny's father. I stared at my sister, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to say she was joking or that I'd misunderstood. But her face was deadly serious, her eyes filled with what looked like genuine remorse. She was still holding my hand, but suddenly her touch felt like a burn, and I yanked my fingers away from hers. My first coherent thought was that she was lying. It had to be a lie, some kind of sick joke or desperate attention-seeking behavior that grief had triggered in her unstable mind. Richard would never. He couldn't have. We'd been married for 27 years. He'd never even looked at another woman, never given me a moment's doubt about his faithfulness. He was the most honest, loyal man I'd ever known. But even as I was forming these thoughts, other pieces were clicking into place with horrible clarity. Danny's blue eyes, Richard's exact shade of blue, the shape of his nose, his mouth, the way he tilted his head, the timing of Claire's move back to Millbrook, the way she'd always changed the subject when anyone asked about Danny's father, the way Richard had seemed so interested in the baby, always asking about him, always offering to help Claire with whatever she needed. I heard myself ask how, when, why, the questions tumbling out in a whisper because I couldn't seem to make my voice work properly. Claire's face crumpled, and she started crying those big dramatic tears she'd perfected in childhood whenever she was in trouble. She said it started about 2 years ago, when she'd first come back to town. She'd been in such a bad place, broke, alone, dealing with another failed relationship. She'd reached out to me for help, and I'd brought Richard with me to help her move into the apartment. She said he'd been so kind to her, so different from all the losers she'd been with. Stable, successful, mature. Everything she'd always wanted but never been able to find. I felt sick listening to her talk about my husband like he was some prize she'd won. She kept going, describing how it started innocently. Richard helping her with repairs around the apartment, Claire calling him when she had car trouble, the two of them talking when I was at work. Just friendship at first, she insisted, nothing inappropriate. But then one evening when I was at my book club meeting, Claire had called Richard in tears about some crisis. I can't remember what she said it was, because by that point my mind was reeling too hard to hold on to details. Richard had gone over to help her, and somehow, she said, one thing led to another. They were both vulnerable, both needing something they weren't getting elsewhere. It just happened, she said, like these things sometimes do. Just happened. Like a tornado just happens. Like cancer just happens. Like betrayal by the two people you trust most in the world just happens. She was still talking, still crying, still explaining, but I couldn't focus on the words anymore. Instead, I was remembering moments from the past 2 years through this new, horrible lens. Times when Richard had come home later than usual, claiming he'd stopped by Claire's to fix her leaky faucet or look at her car's weird noise. Times when he'd seemed distracted during dinner, distant in a way that was unusual for him. Times when Claire had called our house and asked to speak to Richard specifically, saying she needed his advice about some practical matter. I'd been proud of how well my husband and sister got along. I'd been grateful that Richard was so generous with his time and expertise, so willing to help my flaky sister get her life together. I'd even joked with friends about how lucky I was to have a husband who was patient with my dramatic family members. What a fool I'd been. Claire was saying something about how guilty they both felt, how much Richard loved me, how he'd ended things as soon as she found out she was pregnant. She said he'd wanted to tell me everything, but she'd begged him not to. She couldn't bear the thought of destroying my marriage, she said, ruining my happiness for the sake of a mistake that was already over. So they'd agreed to keep it secret. Richard would have no contact with Danny, no role in his life. Claire would raise him alone and never ask Richard for anything, no money, no support, no acknowledgement. It would be like it never happened, except for the beautiful little boy who was the only good thing to come out of their mistake. I was listening to all this while watching my sister's face, trying to find some sign that she understood what she was telling me. She'd slept with my husband. She'd gotten pregnant with his child. She'd spent the past year sitting at my dinner table, celebrating holidays with us, accepting help with groceries and babysitting and apartment repairs, all while carrying the secret that would destroy my entire world. And Richard, my Richard, who'd held my hand through fertility treatments and miscarriages, who'd grieved with me when we finally accepted we'd never have children, who'd promised me that we had enough love between us to fill any empty spaces, had been building a new family with my sister while lying to my face every single day. I stood up from the couch, so fast that my head spun. The wine, the shock, the complete upheaval of everything I thought I knew about my life, it was all hitting me at once. I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself and tried to form words that would express the magnitude of what I was feeling. But before I could speak, Claire was talking again, and what she said next made the first revelation seem almost trivial by comparison. She said that Richard had changed his mind about staying out of Danny's life. About 2 months before he died, he'd started talking about telling me the truth. He said it wasn't fair to Danny to grow up without a father, wasn't fair to any of us to keep living with such a huge lie. He'd been planning to confess everything and ask me for a divorce, so he could be with Claire and Danny properly. The room started spinning around me. I sank back down onto the couch, trying to process this additional layer of betrayal. Not only had Richard been unfaithful, not only had he fathered a child with my sister, he'd been planning to leave me. He'd been planning to destroy our marriage, our home, our entire life together so he could start over with Claire and his son. He died before he could do it, Claire said softly, but his intentions had been clear. He'd even started making changes to prepare for the divorce. Changes that would ensure Claire and Danny were taken care of no matter what happened. I asked what kind of changes, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Claire got up from the couch and walked over to a small desk in the corner of her living room. She opened the top drawer and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. She brought it back to the couch and set it down on the coffee table between us. She said Richard had updated his will 3 months ago. He'd made provisions for Danny, significant provisions. And since he'd been planning to ask for a divorce anyway, he'd structured everything in a way that would ensure his son's future was secure. My hands were shaking as I reached for the folder. Inside were copies of legal documents, a new will, life insurance policies, bank account information. I recognized Richard's signature at the bottom of several pages, that careful handwriting I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for 27 years. The will was devastating in its clarity. Richard had left half of everything to me, as expected, the house, his retirement accounts, his life insurance. But the other half, including half the value of our home on Maple Street, was designated for Danny's care and education, to be managed by Claire as his guardian. Our house was worth about $500,000. We'd paid off the mortgage years ago, had put significant money into renovations and improvements. It was our nest egg, our security, our home. And, according to this document, half of it now belonged to my sister's son. Claire was watching me read through the papers, and I could see her calculating my reaction, trying to gauge how much fight I had left in me. When I finally looked up at her, she had composed herself, wiped away the tears, straightened her shoulders. The grieving, apologetic sister was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. She said she was sorry I had to find out this way, sorry for everything that had happened. But Danny was Richard's son, she said, and he deserved his inheritance. She said she'd been agonizing over whether to tell me about any of this, but with Richard gone, she had to think about her son's future now. She said she'd been hoping we could work something out amicably. Maybe I could sell the house and we could split the proceeds, or I could buy out Danny's half, or we could figure out some other arrangement that would be fair to everyone. She didn't want to make this harder on me than it already was, she said, but she had to protect her child's interests. I stared at her, this stranger wearing my sister's face, talking about making things fair, while she systematically destroyed what was left of my life. 3 days ago, I'd buried my husband believing our marriage had been solid and true. Now I was discovering that everything I'd believed about the most important relationship in my life had been a lie, and the woman I'd trusted to help me through my grief was actually here to claim half my home. I asked her when she'd planned to spring this on me. Had she been waiting for the funeral to be over so she could ambush me while I was still weak and vulnerable? Had she planned this birthday party as some kind of sick celebration of her victory over me? Claire's mask slipped a little then, and I caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating underneath her practiced remorse. She said she'd hoped I'd be more understanding, more willing to see reason. She said Richard would have wanted us to work together for Danny's sake, would have wanted his wife and the mother of his child to find a way to move forward without destroying each other. That's when I started laughing. It wasn't funny, nothing about the situation was even remotely amusing. But something about the way Claire was trying to manipulate me, trying to use Richard's memory to guilt me into compliance, struck me as so absurdly audacious that I couldn't help myself. The laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest, hysterical and uncontrollable. Claire looked alarmed. She asked if I was okay, if I needed some water, if maybe the shock was too much for me to handle all at once. But I couldn't stop laughing long enough to answer her. I was thinking about how carefully she'd planned all of this, how she'd waited until I was at my most vulnerable to deliver the final blow. I was thinking about how proud she must be of herself for orchestrating such a complete destruction of my life. But most of all, I was thinking about something Claire didn't know, something that was going to make her elaborate revenge fantasy a lot more complicated than she'd anticipated. I was thinking about the real reason Richard could never have been Danny's father. My laughter finally died away, leaving Claire staring at me with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. She kept asking if I was all right, if I needed her to call someone, if the shock was making me have some kind of breakdown. But I felt calmer than I had in days, clearer than I'd felt since Richard's death. Because suddenly everything made sense. I picked up the forged will from the coffee table and looked at it more carefully. The signature looked perfect. Claire had done her homework there. The legal language was convincing, the format professional. Someone had put real effort into making this document look authentic. But there were problems with it, details that only someone who'd lived with Richard for 27 years would notice. For one thing, Richard never signed important documents without having our lawyer, Jim Patterson, review them first. He was obsessive about legal matters, never made any significant financial decisions without getting professional advice. Yet according to the date on this will, he'd supposedly made these massive changes to his estate planning without involving Jim at all. For another, Richard had a very specific way of writing dates. He always used the full year, never abbreviated. Always 2023, never 23. But this document showed dates written in a shortened format that Richard would never have used. But those were minor details compared to the much larger problem with Claire's story. The problem that made her elaborate deception not just cruel, but completely impossible. I looked at my sister, still playing her role as the remorseful mother fighting for her child's rights, and decided it was time to stop her performance. I told her I knew she was lying. Claire's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, indignation, hurt, and then something harder, more calculating. She asked what I meant, said she couldn't believe I'd accuse her of lying about something so serious. Did I think she'd make up something like this? Did I think she'd want to hurt me this way if it weren't absolutely true? I said that yes, I thought exactly that. Because I knew something about Richard that Claire obviously didn't know, something that made her story impossible from the very beginning. Richard couldn't have fathered Danny or any other child. He'd had a vasectomy 15 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Claire's face carefully, saw the exact moment when she realized her carefully constructed lie was falling apart. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. For the first time since I'd arrived at the party, she was genuinely speechless. I explained that we'd made the decision together after years of failed fertility treatments had taken such a toll on both of us. The doctors had told us that my eggs were viable, but Richard's sperm count was too low for natural conception. We'd tried artificial insemination, hormone treatments, every option available at the time. Nothing worked. Finally, we'd accepted that biological parenthood wasn't going to happen for us. Rather than continue the expensive and emotionally devastating cycle of treatments and failures, we decided to focus on other ways to build a meaningful life together. Richard had gotten the vasectomy to make sure we never had to go through that heartbreak again. It wasn't something we talked about with anyone, including family. The whole infertility struggle had been intensely private for us, too painful to share with people who might not understand. So Claire wouldn't have known about the vasectomy, wouldn't have realized her lie was medically impossible. But someone else would have known. Someone who'd helped her create that forged will. Someone who'd coached her on what to say. Someone who'd been watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy me. I asked Claire who was really behind this scheme, because I knew she wasn't smart enough or patient enough to have planned something this elaborate on her own. The forged legal documents, the timing of the revelation, the careful manipulation of my grief, it all required a level of strategic thinking that my impulsive sister had never possessed. Claire's face was cycling through emotions so quickly I could barely keep track. Panic, anger, desperation, calculation. She was trying to figure out how to salvage her plan, how to convince me that Richard could somehow have been Danny's father despite the vasectomy. Maybe he'd had it reversed, she suggested weakly. Maybe the procedure hadn't worked properly. Maybe I was mistaken about the whole thing. But I could see in her eyes that she knew it was over. Her grand scheme, whatever it was, had crumbled the moment I mentioned Richard's vasectomy. Now she was just stalling, trying to figure out her next move. I told her I wanted to know who had put her up to this. I wanted names, details, the whole truth about what she'd been planning to do to me. Because this wasn't just about money or property. This was about something much more personal, much more cruel. That's when Claire finally broke. She started crying again, but these weren't the calculated tears from before. These were ugly, desperate sobs that shook her whole body. She collapsed back onto the couch and covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving with the force of her breakdown. Between sobs, the real story started coming out. She said she was in debt, serious debt that she'd been hiding from everyone. Credit cards maxed out, loans from predatory lenders, threats from people who weren't the kind you wanted to owe money to. Moving back to Millbrook hadn't been about starting fresh. It had been about running away from financial disaster. Danny's real father was a married man. That much was true. But he wasn't some noble, successful gentleman caught in a complicated situation. He was a small-time con artist named Marcus who'd been running some kind of investment scam when Claire got involved with him. She'd been one of his marks as much as his lover, had invested her life savings in his fake business venture before discovering she was pregnant, and he was married to someone else. When Marcus's scheme collapsed, he disappeared, leaving Claire broke and pregnant with nowhere to turn. She'd moved back to Millbrook, hoping I'd help her get back on her feet, which I had. But the debts had followed her, and the people Marcus owed money to weren't interested in hearing about how she'd been a victim too. That's when she'd met Richard's business partner. I felt my blood turn to ice when she said that name, David Morrison. Richard had been in business with David for 12 years, running a small engineering consulting firm. They'd been close friends, had spent countless evenings at our house talking shop and planning for their retirement. I'd considered David almost like a brother-in-law, had trusted him completely. But apparently, David had been watching our marriage more carefully than I'd realized. He'd noticed things, small cracks, minor disagreements, moments of distance that every long marriage goes through. He'd also noticed our comfortable lifestyle, our paid-off house, Richard's life insurance policies. Most importantly, he noticed that we had no children, no obvious heirs who would complicate inheritance matters if anything happened to Richard. David had approached Claire about 6 months ago, when her debt problems were becoming desperate. He'd offered her a solution. If something were to happen to Richard, and if Claire could establish a claim to part of his estate, David would help her make it happen. In exchange, she'd split whatever she gained with him, 50-50. The plan had been simple in concept. Claire would claim that Richard was Danny's father, would produce forged documents proving it, and would use my grief and vulnerability to pressure me into a quick settlement. David would back up her story if needed, would provide character testimony about Richard's relationship with Claire, would help establish the plausibility of the affair. They'd been waiting for the right opportunity to put their plan into motion when Richard's heart attack gave them exactly what they needed. I was listening to all of this with a growing sense of rage that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The betrayal by Claire was devastating enough, but David's involvement made it infinitely worse. This was a man who'd sat at my kitchen table hundreds of times, who'd celebrated birthdays and holidays with us, who'd been at Richard's funeral 3 days ago offering me his condolences and his support through this difficult time. While I was standing at my husband's graveside, David had been calculating how to profit from his death. Claire was still talking, still confessing, the words pouring out of her like poison from a wound. She said David had helped her research Richard's financial situation, had coached her on what to say, had even arranged for the forged will to be created by someone he knew who specialized in that kind of thing. He told her exactly how to approach me, how to use my grief against me, how to time the revelation for maximum emotional impact. But she swore she hadn't known about the vasectomy. David hadn't known either, apparently. It was the one piece of information they hadn't been able to discover in their research. If they'd known, she said, they never would have tried this approach. They'd have found some other way to get at Richard's money. I asked what other way, and Claire's face went pale. She realized she'd said too much, had revealed that there were backup plans, other schemes already in motion. She tried to backtrack, tried to claim she didn't know what David might have been planning, but I could see the fear in her eyes. That's when I understood that Richard's death might not have been as natural as everyone assumed. The thought hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and horrifying that I had to grip the arm of the couch to keep from falling over. Richard had died of a heart attack, sudden and massive, with no warning signs. He'd been in good health, took care of himself, had just passed his annual physical with flying colors. The doctors had said it was one of those tragic things that sometimes happen, a perfect storm of genetics and stress and bad luck. But what if it hadn't been luck at all? What if David, watching Richard's growing discomfort with keeping secrets from me, had decided that his business partner was becoming a liability? I voiced this thought to Claire, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't known, hadn't been part of that aspect of David's plan, but she'd suspected. The timing of Richard's death, so convenient for their scheme, had troubled her even as she'd been preparing to benefit from it. She started shaking her head frantically, saying she'd never wanted anyone to get hurt, that she'd just been desperate for money, that she'd never imagined David would go that far. But her protests only confirmed what I was beginning to realize, that my husband hadn't just been betrayed and stolen from, he'd been murdered. And the man who'd killed him was planning to use my sister's desperation to steal everything Richard had left behind. I stood up from the couch, my mind racing with implications and possibilities. Claire was still crying, still trying to convince me that she was just a victim too, that she'd been manipulated by David just like I had been. Maybe that was true. Maybe she really hadn't known how far David was willing to go. But it didn't matter now. What mattered was stopping him before he could do any more damage. I told Claire that she had two choices. She could help me prove what David had done, could cooperate in exposing his schemes and bringing him to justice. Or she could continue to protect him and find herself facing charges as an accomplice to fraud and possibly murder. The decision wasn't hard for her to make. Whatever loyalty she might have felt toward David evaporated the moment she realized he might have killed Richard to make their plan work. She agreed to help me, to provide whatever evidence she had, to testify about David's involvement if necessary. But first, I told her, we needed to let David think his plan was still working. We needed to make him believe that I'd been fooled by Claire's story, that I was prepared to cooperate with their demands. We needed him to feel confident enough to make his next move, whatever that might be. Because I was beginning to formulate a plan of my own, one that would give David exactly what he deserved for what he'd done to Richard and to me. I was going to destroy him just as thoroughly as he'd tried to destroy me. The rest of that Sunday afternoon, Claire and I sat in her living room planning David Morrison's downfall. It was surreal, collaborating with the sister who'd just tried to rob me, but we both understood that David was the real enemy here. Claire had been desperate and foolish, but David had been calculating and murderous. First, I needed to understand exactly how deep David's planning had gone. Claire told me he'd been monitoring Richard's behavior for months, watching for signs that Richard might confess about the supposed affair. When Richard had started asking her questions about telling the truth, about doing right by Danny, David had become increasingly agitated. She said David had started talking about how inconvenient it would be if Richard developed a conscience, how much simpler everything would be if Richard wasn't around to complicate matters. At the time, she thought he was just venting frustration. Now, looking back, she realized he'd been planning Richard's murder even then. The heart attack had been too perfect, too convenient. David had access to Richard's office, his coffee mug, his food. He traveled to medical conferences regularly where he could have made contacts with people who knew about untraceable drugs. He was smart enough and connected enough to have arranged something that would look completely natural. But proving it would be nearly impossible without a confession or some other direct evidence. Heart attacks are common enough, and Richard's body had already been cremated per his wishes. The medical examiner had seen no reason to run additional tests, and by now, any traces of potential toxins would be long gone. So we have to focus on what we could prove: the fraud, the forgery, the conspiracy to defraud Richard's estate. If we could get David to incriminate himself there, maybe we could use that leverage to get him to admit to the murder. Claire showed me text messages between her and David, conversations about timing and approach, discussions about how to split the money once they'd successfully conned me out of it. She had emails with attachments showing drafts of the forged will, records of payments David had made to the forger. It was enough evidence to destroy him legally, but I wanted more than that. I wanted him to suffer the way I'd suffered. I wanted him to experience the complete destruction of everything he thought he could count on. Monday morning, I called David and asked if we could meet for coffee. I told him I was struggling with practical matters related to Richard's estate, that I needed his advice about business issues I didn't understand. He was immediately sympathetic, offering to help however he could, promising to take care of everything so I wouldn't have to worry about complicated financial matters while I was grieving. The concern in his voice was so convincing that if I hadn't known what I knew, I would have been genuinely grateful for his support. As it was, listening to him pretend to care about my welfare while actively plotting to rob me made my skin crawl. We met at a little cafe downtown where David and Richard used to have their weekly business meetings. David ordered for both of us coffee and pastries, like he was trying to recreate some sense of normalcy for me. He asked how I was holding up, whether I was sleeping, whether I needed help with any household repairs or maintenance issues. I played my part perfectly, the grieving widow who is overwhelmed by practical concerns and grateful for any support. I mentioned that Claire had been helpful, that she'd been spending a lot of time with me since the funeral. I said it was nice to feel like I had family looking out for me during such a difficult time. David's expression flickered slightly when I mentioned Claire, just for a second, but enough to confirm that he was monitoring the situation carefully. He asked how Claire was doing, whether she was managing all right as a single mother. Such a challenging situation, he said, raising a child alone without any help from the father. I agreed that it must be difficult for her. Then I mentioned, casually, that she'd seemed upset about something when I'd seen her yesterday. She'd hinted that she had something important to tell me, but then had gotten emotional and said maybe it wasn't the right time. I wondered if David had any idea what might be troubling her. He said he couldn't imagine, but suggested that maybe Claire was just feeling the weight of family responsibility now that I was alone. Maybe she felt like she needed to be more involved in my life, more supportive, but wasn't sure how to navigate that new dynamic. It was a masterful performance, the way he guided the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go without seeming to push. He was setting up Claire's eventual revelation, preparing me to be receptive when she finally told me about Danny's supposed paternity. If I hadn't known it was manipulation, I would have been impressed by his psychological skill. Over the next few days, David called me regularly to check on me. He offered to help with paperwork, suggested that I might want to review Richard's will and insurance policies to make sure I understood my financial situation. He recommended his lawyer friend, who could help me navigate any legal complexities that might arise. Everything he did was designed to position himself as my trusted advisor, the person I'd turn to when Claire finally dropped her bombshell. He wanted to be the one I'd come to for guidance, the one who'd help me make sense of the devastating revelation and figure out how to handle it fairly. Meanwhile, Claire was playing her part too. She called me several times, each conversation growing more emotional, more loaded with hints about secrets she was carrying. She mentioned Danny's resemblance to someone I might know, wondered aloud about genetics and inheritance, talked about how hard it was to keep important truths to yourself when they affected people you loved. By Thursday, David was asking if everything was all right, if Claire had seemed upset about anything during our recent conversations. He said he'd noticed she seemed troubled when he'd run into her at the grocery store, and he wondered if there was some family issue I needed help dealing with. I told him Claire had been hinting about telling me something important, but kept backing down at the last minute. I said I was worried she was in some kind of trouble, but didn't know how to get her to open up to me. David suggested that maybe I should invite Claire over for dinner, create a comfortable, private environment where she'd feel safe sharing whatever was on her mind. He said family secrets had a way of eating at people from the inside, and maybe Claire just needed permission to be honest about whatever was troubling her. Perfect. He was practically writing the script for his own downfall. That Friday, I invited Claire over for dinner, exactly as David had suggested. But before she arrived, I made some preparations he didn't know about. I set up a recording device in my kitchen, hidden where it would capture our entire conversation clearly. I also called my real lawyer, not David's recommended friend, and arranged for him to be on standby in case I needed immediate legal assistance. Most importantly, I called Detective Sarah Martinez from the Millbrook Police Department. Sarah had been Richard's friend since high school, and she'd been one of the most compassionate people at the funeral. I told her I discovered some information that might indicate Richard's death wasn't natural, and asked if she could be available that evening in case I needed to file a formal complaint. Sarah was skeptical. Heart attacks were rarely mysterious, but she agreed to keep her phone on and respond quickly if I called. She said if I really had evidence of foul play, she'd want to hear it as soon as possible. Everything was in place. Now I just had to wait for Claire to deliver her performance and for David to reveal himself completely. Claire arrived at 6 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same nervous expression she'd perfected over the past week. She hugged me tightly, asked how I was feeling, commented on how quiet the house seemed without Richard's presence. All the right notes for someone preparing to deliver devastating news to a grieving widow. We had dinner first, leftovers from the casseroles people had brought after the funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were eating food brought by people who genuinely cared about my well-being while preparing to expose someone who'd been pretending to care while plotting my destruction. During dinner, Claire worked up to her revelation gradually, just as she had the Sunday before. She talked about secrets and family loyalty, about protecting people you love even when it costs you personally. She talked about Danny's future, about wanting to do right by him even if it meant having difficult conversations. I played my part too, expressing concern for her obvious distress, encouraging her to tell me whatever was troubling her, promising that nothing she could say would change how much I loved her or how important family was to me. Finally, just as we were finishing dessert, Claire took a deep breath and delivered her lines. Richard was Danny's father. They'd had an affair. He'd planned to leave me. There was a new will that provided for his son. She was sorry, so very sorry, but she had to think about Danny's future now. I responded exactly as I had before: shock, denial, demand for details, gradual acceptance of the devastating truth. But this time, everything was being recorded. This time, I was prepared for what came next. Claire produced the forged will, the fake documentation, all the evidence that David had helped her create. She explained about Richard's supposed change of heart, his desire to be a proper father to Danny, his plans to confess everything to me before his untimely death. And then, right on schedule, my phone rang. It was David calling to check on me just as he'd been doing all week. But this time, when he heard the emotional strain in my voice, he insisted on coming over immediately. He said he could tell something was wrong, and he wouldn't feel right leaving me alone to deal with whatever crisis had developed. Such a caring friend. Such a devoted partner to my late husband. Such a concerned protector of my well-being. He had no idea that he was walking straight into a trap that would destroy him completely. David arrived at my house within 20 minutes of my phone call, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move before. He knocked on the front door with authority, like someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. When I let him in, his eyes immediately went to Claire, taking in her tear-stained face and the scattered legal documents on my kitchen table. He was good, I had to give him that. His expression showed exactly the right mixture of concern and confusion, like someone walking into a family drama he couldn't quite understand. He asked if everything was all right, said he'd been worried about me all week, noticed that I'd seemed increasingly stressed during our recent conversations. I told him Claire had just shared some very difficult information with me, something about Richard that was hard to process. I said I didn't know what to do, didn't know who to trust or how to handle such a complicated situation. I was the perfect picture of an overwhelmed widow seeking guidance from a trusted family friend. David moved into protective mode immediately. He guided me to a chair, got me a glass of water, assured me that whatever the problem was, we could figure it out together. He'd promised Richard he'd look after me, he said, and he intended to honor that promise no matter what challenges arose. The irony was breathtaking. Here was the man who'd murdered my husband, offering to help me through the crisis he'd orchestrated. Claire was watching this performance with fascination, seeing David's manipulative skills in action for the first time. Until now, she'd only interacted with him in planning sessions, when he was focused on logistics and strategy. This was her first glimpse of how smoothly he could lie, how convincingly he could play the role of concerned friend and advisor. David sat down across from me and asked Claire to explain what she'd told me. His tone was gentle but authoritative, like a mediator trying to understand all sides of a dispute. Claire looked at me uncertainly, as if asking permission to repeat her story in front of someone else. I nodded encouragingly, so Claire launched into her tale again. The affair with Richard, the pregnancy, the secret they'd kept to protect my marriage. David listened with perfect expressions of shock and sympathy, occasionally glancing at me to gauge my emotional state. When Claire finished, David was quiet for a long moment, as if processing information that genuinely surprised him. Then he said exactly what I'd expected him to say. He admitted he'd suspected something was going on between Richard and Claire. There had been signs, he said, Richard's distracted behavior, his tendency to work late on nights when Claire needed help with something, phone calls that Richard would take in private. As Richard's business partner and closest friend, David had noticed changes in Richard's mood and demeanor over the past year. But he'd never imagined it had gone this far. He'd never suspected there was a child involved, never dreamed that Richard had been planning to leave me for Claire. If he'd known, he said, he would have tried to talk Richard out of such a destructive course of action. It was a masterful performance, building credibility for Claire's story while positioning himself as an innocent observer who'd been kept in the dark about the full extent of his partner's deception. He was validating Claire's claims without appearing to have any stake in the outcome. Then he started doing exactly what I'd predicted he'd do, helping me understand my options, guiding me toward the solution he wanted. He said that as difficult as this revelation was, I needed to consider Danny's rights. If Richard truly was the boy's father, then legally speaking, Danny was entitled to inherit from Richard's estate. The will Claire had shown me appeared to be legitimate, properly witnessed and notarized. As much as it hurt to discover Richard's betrayal, I couldn't let my personal feelings override a child's legal claim to his father's support. I played the part of someone struggling with competing emotions, hurt by Richard's betrayal, but also sympathetic to an innocent child's needs. I said it was hard to think clearly about legal matters when my whole world had been turned upside down, but that I wanted to do the right thing. David offered to help me review the legal documents, to consult with attorneys who could advise me about my options. He said the most important thing was making sure Danny's inheritance was properly protected, but that there might be ways to structure things that would be fair to everyone involved. For instance, he suggested, maybe I could sell the house and split the proceeds with Danny's trust fund, then use my half to buy a smaller place that would be more manageable for me anyway. Or maybe there was a way to arrange shared ownership of the property that would preserve Danny's inheritance while allowing me to continue living there. He was so helpful, so focused on my well-being and Danny's rights. Just a concerned friend trying to help two families navigate a difficult situation created by his deceased business partner's poor choices. But while he was talking, I was watching his hands, and I noticed something interesting. David was wearing a ring I'd never seen before. A gold signet ring with an unusual design, something that looked like it might have been custom-made. When he gestured, the light caught it in a way that made the engraving clearly visible. It was Richard's ring. Richard had worn that ring every day for the 15 years I'd known him. It had belonged to his grandfather, a family heirloom he'd inherited when his grandmother died. Richard never took it off, not even when he was working on mechanical projects that might damage it. He'd been wearing it the day he died. I remembered seeing it on his hand when the paramedics were working on him. Somehow, David had taken it, either from Richard's body at the hospital, or from his personal effects before they were returned to me. He'd stolen a dead man's ring, and was now wearing it while he attempted to defraud that man's widow. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. This was personal in the most intimate way possible. David had murdered my husband, and was now wearing his jewelry, like a trophy. But I couldn't let my emotions show.
Not yet.
I needed David to incriminate himself further, needed him to reveal more of his plan, needed enough evidence to destroy him completely. So I continued to play my role, the confused widow grateful for guidance from her husband's trusted friend. I asked David what he thought I should do, how he thought Richard would want me to handle this situation if he were still alive. David said he thought Richard would want me to be generous with Danny, would want a son to have every advantage in life. Richard had always been fair and responsible, always put family obligations ahead of personal desires. Even if his affair had been a terrible mistake, his commitment to supporting his child would have been absolute. The way David talked about Richard, with such apparent affection and respect, while simultaneously plotting to profit from his murder, was genuinely sickening. But it was also useful because it was helping me understand just how long David had been planning this scheme. He knew too much about Richard's supposed feelings and motivations. He was too confident about what Richard would have wanted, too certain about decisions that would have been deeply personal and complex. This wasn't someone improvising based on Claire's story. This was someone who'd been developing this narrative for months. I asked David if he thought the legal documents were legitimate, if Claire's story was believable. I said I was having trouble reconciling the Richard I'd known with the man Claire was describing, the husband who'd been planning to leave me for my own sister. David said deception was unfortunately more common than people wanted to believe. Men going through midlife crises often made choices that were completely out of character, especially when they felt like they'd missed out on important experiences like fatherhood. Richard's affair might have started innocently enough, but once Claire became pregnant, everything would have changed. He said he'd seen it happen before, good men making terrible decisions because they felt trapped between competing loyalties. Richard probably never intended to hurt me, probably agonized over his situation for months before deciding that honesty was the only way forward. Again, too much detail, too much certainty about Richard's internal emotional process. David was revealing that he'd been involved in planning Richard's supposed confession, had been coaching Richard on how to handle the situation. Except Richard had never been planning to confess anything, because there had never been an affair. David had been manipulating both Richard and Claire, setting up a situation where Richard's death would create the perfect opportunity for fraud. I was starting to understand David's complete plan now. He'd probably been pressuring Richard to make changes to his will, using some fabricated business need or legal requirement to justify updating estate documents. When Richard had resisted or become suspicious, David had decided that elimination was simpler than continued manipulation. But I still needed him to say it explicitly. I needed a confession, either about the murder or about the fraud scheme, something that would be clear enough on the recording to use as evidence. So I decided to push him a little harder. I said I was having trouble believing that Richard would have made such significant changes to his will without talking to me about it first. We'd always made major financial decisions together, had always been transparent about our legal and estate planning. It seemed out of character for him to revise his will so dramatically without at least giving me some advance warning. David's expression flickered slightly, just for a moment. but long enough for me to see calculation behind his concern. He was realizing that I might be more suspicious than he'd anticipated, that his perfectly laid plans might be encountering unexpected resistance. That's when he made his first real mistake. He said that actually, Richard had mentioned wanting to update his will, had asked David for advice about making provisions for unexpected beneficiaries. David had recommended his lawyer friend who specialized in discreet estate planning, had even offered to facilitate the meeting to spare Richard any awkwardness. But Richard had never mentioned unexpected beneficiaries to me. And I'd never heard David recommend any lawyers before. He'd always insisted that legal matters should be handled by established firms with good reputations, not by individual practitioners who specialized in discreet services. David was revealing details he couldn't have known unless he'd been directly involved in creating the forged will. He was admitting to participating in the fraud, even if he didn't realize that's what he was doing. I asked for the name of this lawyer, said I might want to contact him to verify the will's authenticity and understand exactly what Richard had requested. David said he'd have to look up the contact information, that it wasn't someone he worked with regularly. Another lie. If David had really referred Richard to this lawyer for such an important matter, he would have remembered the man's name and contact information immediately. But the most revealing thing was David's growing nervousness. He was starting to sweat, starting to fidget with that stolen ring on his finger. He was realizing that his perfectly orchestrated con might not be going as smoothly as he'd planned. That's when I decided it was time to start dismantling his world. I stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen counter, ostensibly to refill my water glass. But really, I wanted to change the dynamic of our conversation, to shift from the vulnerable widow seeking guidance to something a little less predictable. I turned back to David and Claire, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I smiled genuinely. I said I had some questions about the timeline of events they'd described to me, some details that weren't quite adding up in my mind. Nothing major, just little inconsistencies that were bothering me, the way small details sometimes bother people who are trying to process shocking information. David immediately became more alert, his posture straightening as he sensed a shift in my demeanor. But he maintained his concerned advisor persona, saying of course I should ask questions, that it was natural to need clarification when dealing with such overwhelming revelations. I asked Claire when exactly her affair with Richard had started. She'd been vague about dates before, but now I wanted specifics. What month? What circumstances? What had led to that first moment of infidelity? Claire glanced nervously at David before answering. She said it had been about 18 months ago, maybe 20 months. Richard had been helping her move some furniture, and they'd gotten caught in a rainstorm, had ended up talking for hours while waiting for it to pass. One thing had led to another. I nodded thoughtfully and asked about Danny's conception date. If the affair had started 18 to 20 months ago, and Danny was just turning 1, the timing seemed about right. But I wanted to make sure I understood correctly. Claire said Danny had been born in early October the previous year, which would put his conception around late December or early January. That would have been about 3 months into the affair, assuming her timeline was accurate. I asked David if he'd noticed any changes in Richard's behavior around that time. Had Richard seemed distracted or secretive during late December and early January? Had there been any obvious signs that something significant was happening in his personal life? David said that actually, yes, Richard had seemed different around the holidays. More withdrawn, more prone to mood swings, working later hours. At the time, David had attributed it to seasonal depression or stress from year-end business responsibilities. But in hindsight, it made sense that Richard would have been struggling with guilt about his affair and anxiety about Claire's pregnancy. Perfect. David was building the case against himself with every answer. Because I remembered late December and early January perfectly. Richard and I had taken a 2-week vacation to Hawaii over Christmas and New Year's, our first real vacation in 3 years. We'd been together constantly for 14 days straight, rarely apart for more than an hour or two. Richard had been relaxed and happy during that trip, more affectionate and attentive than he'd been in months. There was no way he could have gotten Claire pregnant during late December or early January. We'd been on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and I had photos, receipts, and airline tickets to prove it. But instead of revealing this information immediately, I decided to let David dig himself deeper. I asked him about Richard's will revision, when that had supposedly taken place. David said it had been about 3 months before Richard's death, which would put it around early July. Richard had been anxious to get his affairs in order, David explained, once he decided to come clean about the affair. I nodded and asked if David had been present when Richard met with the lawyer to update his will. David said no, Richard had wanted to handle it privately. But Richard had showed David the final documents afterward, had asked for his advice about the best way to tell me about the changes. Another mistake. If Richard had really updated his will to include provisions for Danny, he would have needed detailed information about the child, full name, date of birth, social security number, Claire's legal information as guardian. David was claiming to have seen these documents, which meant he should have known about Danny's existence long before Claire's revelation today. But David had acted completely surprised when Claire told her story about Richard being Danny's father. He'd given no indication that he'd known about the child previously, had responded with exactly the right degree of shock and confusion. He couldn't have it both ways. Either he'd known about Danny from the will revision, or he'd been genuinely surprised by Claire's revelation. The fact that he was claiming both things were true revealed that he was improvising poorly, trying to maintain multiple versions of the truth, without keeping track of which story he'd told when. I asked David where Richard had supposedly met with this estate planning lawyer. David said he thought it had been at the lawyer's office, but he wasn't sure of the exact location. Maybe downtown, maybe in one of the suburban office complexes. But if David had really referred Richard to this lawyer, if he'd really facilitated the meeting, he would have known exactly where Richard had gone. The vagueness was another clear indication that no such meeting had ever taken place. I decided it was time to start revealing what I knew. I told David and Claire that I'd been doing some thinking since Claire first shared her story with me, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Some aspects of their account were troubling me, not because I doubted their honesty, but because certain details seemed inconsistent with other things I knew about Richard. For instance, I said, Richard had always been extremely cautious about legal and financial matters. He never made significant decisions without extensive research and multiple consultations. The idea that he would revise his will through some lawyer he'd never worked with before, without getting a second opinion or involving our regular attorney, seemed very out of character. David said that people sometimes acted out of character when they were under extreme emotional stress. Richard had probably been so overwhelmed by guilt and anxiety about his situation that he'd cut corners he normally wouldn't have cut. I said that was possible, but there were other details that bother me too. Like the timing of Danny's conception, which according to Claire's account would have occurred during the 2 weeks Richard and I were vacationing in Hawaii together. The silence that followed was profound. Both David and Claire stared at me, clearly trying to process the implications of what I'd just said. Claire's face went pale, and she started to stammer something about maybe being mistaken about the exact dates. But David recovered more quickly. He said that conception dates weren't always precise, that Claire might have miscalculated based on when she first realized she was pregnant. These things happened earlier or later than people expected all the time. I smiled and said that was true. Dates could be tricky. But fortunately, there were ways to be more precise about these things. For instance, I'd kept detailed records of our Hawaii vacation, photos with timestamps, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, even GPS data from Richard's phone that our cell phone company could verify. More importantly, I said, there was the medical evidence to consider. David asked what medical evidence, and I could hear the first note of real panic creeping into his voice. I explained that when Richard and I had struggled with infertility years ago, we'd undergone extensive medical testing. The doctors had determined that while my eggs were healthy, Richard had essentially no viable sperm production. The condition was genetic, irreversible, and absolute. Richard could never have fathered children with anyone. The room went completely silent. Claire was staring at me with her mouth open, finally understanding that her carefully constructed lie was medically impossible. But David's reaction was more interesting. Instead of surprise or confusion, I saw something that looked like rage flash across his face before he controlled his expression. He wasn't shocked by this revelation. He was angry that I knew it, which meant he'd already known about Richard's infertility when he'd helped Claire construct her story. He'd known the paternity claim was false from the beginning, but he proceeded with the fraud anyway because he'd assumed I didn't know about Richard's medical condition. That was his fatal mistake. I asked David how he thought we should proceed, given this new information. Obviously, Claire had been mistaken about Danny's paternity, but that didn't change the fact that she was struggling financially and needed support. Maybe there was some other way Richard's estate could help her out, some provision in his real will that would provide assistance to family members in need. David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him calculating furiously behind his eyes. His perfect plan was disintegrating, but he was trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage something from the wreckage. That's when he made his second fatal mistake. He suggested that maybe Richard's medical records were incomplete or inaccurate. Maybe the doctors had been wrong about his condition, or maybe it had improved over time. These things could change as men got older, he said. Perhaps we should have Danny's paternity tested to be absolutely certain before dismissing Claire's claims entirely. Asked David how he knew so much about male fertility issues and how conditions could change over time. Had he researched this topic recently? Had someone asked him to look into the medical aspects of male infertility? The question caught him off guard. He fumbled for an answer, saying he'd just picked up information over the years, that he'd had friends who dealt with similar issues. But his response revealed something crucial. David had been researching Richard's medical condition. He'd been trying to find ways around the infertility problem, trying to figure out if there was any scenario where Richard could have fathered a child despite his condition. Which meant David had known about Richard's infertility before tonight, had known it when he'd helped Claire construct her false paternity claim. I asked David point-blank, had he known about Richard's infertility when he'd suggested this paternity scheme to Claire? David's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, denial, anger, and finally something that looked almost like admiration. He realized I'd been setting a trap for him, had been leading him into contradictions and revelations that exposed his involvement in the fraud. For the first time since he'd arrived, David dropped his concerned advisor persona completely. He asked me how long I'd known that Claire was lying. I told him I'd known from the moment Claire first told her story. I'd let her continue because I'd wanted to understand who else was involved, who had helped her create such an elaborate deception. Now I knew. David leaned back in his chair and actually smiled, like someone who'd just lost a game but could appreciate the skill of his opponent. He said he'd underestimated me, had assumed that grief and shock would make me easier to manipulate. I said he'd made several underestimations. He'd underestimated my knowledge of Richard's medical condition, my memory of our travel schedule, my ability to detect inconsistencies in his story. Most importantly, he'd underestimated how much Richard had loved me. David asked what I meant by that, and I explained that Richard had told me about David's recent behavior, his strange questions about updating wills and estate planning, his sudden interest in our financial situation and inheritance laws. Richard had been concerned about David's increasing focus on money and legal matters, especially after David had started asking hypothetical questions about what would happen to Richard's assets if something happened to him. Richard had mentioned these conversations to me, had wondered if David was having some kind of financial crisis that was making him think obsessively about death and inheritance. David's face went very still. He asked when Richard had supposedly shared these concerns with me. I told him it had been during our last conversation, just an hour before Richard died. Richard had mentioned that he was planning to have a serious talk with David about his inappropriate questions and his obvious financial stress. He'd been worried about his business partner and friend, had wanted to offer help if David needed it. But David had never gotten the chance to have that conversation, had he? Because Richard had died so suddenly, so unexpectedly, so conveniently for David's plans. That's when David stopped pretending entirely. He stood up from the table and asked me what I wanted from him. Money? A confession? Some kind of acknowledgement of what I thought I'd figured out? I told him I wanted him to tell me how he'd killed Richard. David laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. He said I had a vivid imagination, that I was creating elaborate conspiracy theories to avoid accepting the simple truth that my husband had died of natural causes. But his body language was telling a different story. He was fidgeting with Richard's ring, touching his phone, glancing toward the door like someone calculating escape routes. I told him about the recording device that had been capturing our entire conversation, about the police detective who was standing by to respond if I needed help, about the evidence Claire had already agreed to provide about their fraud scheme. More importantly, I told him about the autopsy I'd requested. David went completely pale. He said Richard had already been cremated, that it was too late for any kind of medical examination. I smiled and told him he was wrong. When Richard died, I'd been too shocked and grief-stricken to think clearly about practical matters. But over the past few days, as I'd started to suspect that his death wasn't natural, I'd made some inquiries. It turned out that when someone dies unexpectedly, especially someone in good health, the medical examiner's office routinely retains tissue samples and blood work for a period of time in case additional testing becomes necessary. Detective Martinez had expedited my request for additional toxicology testing, and the results would be available within a few days. If David had used some kind of drug or poison to trigger Richard's heart attack, we'd know about it soon enough. David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could continue to deny everything and hope the toxicology tests didn't reveal anything incriminating. He could try to run, though that would essentially be an admission of guilt. Or he could try to negotiate some kind of deal before the evidence made his situation impossible. Instead, he chose a fourth option. He asked me what I thought would happen if he confessed to everything. Would that make me feel better? Would that bring Richard back? Would that undo the damage that had already been done to everyone involved? I told him it would be a start. That's when David finally told me the truth about everything, the planning, the murder, the fraud scheme, all of it. And the truth was even worse than I'd imagined. David Morrison had been planning to kill Richard for almost 2 years. It hadn't started as a murder plot, he explained with a detached tone of someone describing a business transaction. Initially, it had just been about money. David had been embezzling from their consulting firm for 3 years, skimming from client accounts and falsifying records to cover the thefts. He'd gotten in too deep with gambling debts and bad investments, had borrowed against money that didn't belong to him. Richard was getting suspicious. He'd started asking questions about discrepancies in their books, requesting copies of financial records that David had been doctoring, suggesting they bring in an outside accountant to review their business practices. David knew it was only a matter of time before Richard discovered the embezzlement, and when that happened, David would face criminal charges that would destroy his life completely. So, he'd started exploring alternatives. Richard's life insurance policies were substantial, enough to pay off David's debts and leave him with a comfortable cushion for starting over somewhere else. As Richard's business partner, David was the primary beneficiary of their partnership agreement, which meant Richard's half of the consulting firm would revert to him automatically. Combined with Richard's life insurance, David would be able to solve all his financial problems and eliminate the person who posed the greatest threat to his freedom. But there was a complication me. As Richard's widow, I would inherit most of his personal assets, including our house and his retirement accounts. David needed access to that money too, needed a way to claim a larger share of Richard's estate than the partnership agreement provided. That's when he'd started researching Richard's family situation and discovered that Richard and I had no children, no obvious heirs who would complicate inheritance matters. But it had also given him an idea. What if Richard did have an heir? What if there was a child somewhere who could claim a substantial portion of Richard's estate, a child whose guardian might be willing to share that inheritance with the person who'd helped establish the child's claim? David had approached Claire because she was desperate and vulnerable, struggling with debts and facing pressure from creditors who weren't patient with late payments. He'd offered her a partnership. If she could establish a plausible claim that Richard was her son's father, David would help her access Richard's estate, and they'd split whatever they managed to obtain. The plan had seemed perfect in theory. Claire would claim Danny was Richard's son, would produce forged documents supporting her claim, and would use my grief and vulnerability to pressure me into a quick settlement. David would validate her story, would provide expert testimony about Richard's behavior and relationships, would help establish the credibility of her claims. But when David had started researching the details necessary to make the paternity claim believable, he'd discovered Richard's infertility. That should have ended the scheme immediately, should have forced them to find some other approach. Instead, it had given David a better idea. If Richard discovered the paternity fraud before his planned death, He might expose David's involvement and ruin everything. But if Richard died before the fraud was revealed, David could claim he'd been deceived too, could position himself as another victim of Claire's elaborate lies while secretly helping her access the estate he needed her to inherit. The infertility issue actually made things simpler, David explained. I probably didn't know about Richard's medical condition. Most couples kept fertility problems private, and Richard had never been one to share personal information unnecessarily. If David could kill Richard and then help Claire present her false paternity claim, I'd be too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to investigate thoroughly before agreeing to some kind of settlement. By the time I recovered enough to ask detailed questions or demand medical evidence, Claire would already have legal standing as Danny's guardian, and untangling the fraud would be complicated and expensive. David was betting that I'd prefer to negotiate a reasonable division of assets rather than fight a prolonged legal battle against a woman claiming to represent my husband's child. So David had started planning Richard's murder. He'd researched methods extensively, looking for something that would mimic natural causes convincingly enough to avoid triggering a detailed medical investigation. Heart attacks were common, especially in men Richard's age, with high-stress careers. If David could induce cardiac arrest without leaving obvious traces of foul play, Richard's death would be attributed to natural causes and cremated quickly, destroying any evidence before questions could be asked. David had access to Richard's office, his coffee mug, his food and drinks. He'd also had access to medical conferences and professional contacts who might provide information about drugs that could trigger cardiac events. Through a contact at a pharmaceutical research facility, he'd obtained a small amount of a compound that would cause massive cardiac arrhythmia when introduced into the bloodstream, but would break down quickly and leave minimal traces in routine toxicology screening. The morning Richard died, David had added the substance to Richard's coffee during one of their regular business meetings. The dose was carefully calculated to take effect within 2 to 4 hours, long after David had left and established an alibi elsewhere. Richard had gone home feeling fine, had sat down for his normal morning routine with me, and had died exactly as David had planned, suddenly, with no warning, in a way that appeared completely natural. David had been genuinely surprised by how much Richard's death had affected him emotionally. Despite everything, they'd been friends and partners for 12 years. David had convinced himself that he was just solving a practical problem, removing an obstacle that was threatening his survival. He hadn't anticipated the guilt and grief that would follow. But the plan had worked perfectly. Richard's death was ruled natural causes, his body was cremated per his wishes, and David was free to proceed with the fraud scheme. All he needed was for Claire to approach me with her paternity claim and for me to accept it without too much investigation, which had seemed likely, given how devastated I'd been by Richard's death and how much I'd always trusted both David and Claire. David had miscalculated on several fronts, but his biggest mistake was underestimating how well I'd known my husband. I'd known about Richard's vasectomy because we'd made that decision together after our fertility struggles. I'd known about our Hawaii vacation because I'd planned and booked it myself. I'd known about Richard's careful approach to legal matters because I'd watched him research and deliberate over every significant decision for 27 years. Most importantly, I'd known that Richard loved me completely and would never have betrayed our marriage with my sister or anyone else. All those little details that David thought he could lie about or manipulate, they were details I knew intimately, details that revealed his deception the moment he tried to use them. As David was finishing his confession, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Detective Martinez and several other police officers approaching my front door. David heard them too, and for a moment, he looked like he might try to run. Instead, he took off Richard's ring and set it on the table in front of me. He said he was sorry, that he'd never intended for things to go as far as they had. He'd just been trying to solve his financial problems and had made increasingly desperate choices that had led him to places he'd never imagined going. But even his apology was manipulative, focused on his own regrets rather than acknowledging the magnitude of what he'd done to Richard and to me. I picked up Richard's ring and slipped it into my pocket. Then I walked to the front door and let Detective Martinez into my house. Claire had been silent throughout David's entire confession, sitting frozen at my kitchen table as the full scope of his planning became clear. She thought she was getting involved in a simple fraud scheme, a way to claim money from someone who could afford to lose it. She'd never imagined she was helping to cover up a murder, never realized that David had killed the man whose death was making their con possible. When the police officers asked if she wanted to cooperate in prosecuting David's crimes, Claire agreed immediately. Whatever loyalty she might have felt toward him evaporated completely once she understood that he'd made her an unwitting accomplice to murder. David was arrested that night and charged with first-degree murder, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The toxicology tests I'd requested came back positive for the compound David had described, providing physical evidence that supported his confession. Combined with the recorded conversation, Claire's testimony, and the financial records showing David's embezzlement from their business, the case against him was overwhelming. But David's conviction didn't undo the damage he'd done. It didn't bring Richard back or restore the trust that had been shattered by his betrayal and Claire's participation in his scheme. It didn't erase the knowledge that someone we'd both considered family had been calculating Richard's murder while sitting at our dinner table and pretending to be our friend. Some kinds of damage can't be repaired, only survived. And I was about to discover that surviving this experience would require strengths I didn't know I possessed. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and every day of it felt like reliving Richard's death over and over again. I sat in that courthouse listening to medical examiners explain how the poison had stopped my husband's heart, watching David's defense attorney try to paint him as a desperate man who'd made terrible choices under financial pressure, hearing Claire testify about how David had manipulated her desperation into participation in his crimes. The hardest part was learning details about Richard's final moments that I'd never known before. The toxicologist explained that the compound David used would have caused increasing chest pain and difficulty breathing for several minutes before triggering the fatal cardiac event. Richard would have known something was seriously wrong, would have had time to be afraid, time to realize he might be dying. I kept thinking about how he'd reached for me in those last seconds, how he'd said my name with such confusion and fear in his voice. He'd died knowing something was happening to him, but not understanding what or why. He died thinking it was just bad luck, just his body failing him, never knowing that someone he trusted had poisoned him deliberately. David's attorney tried every strategy possible to minimize his client's culpability. They claimed the embezzlement was a result of gambling addiction, a disease that had impaired his judgment. They argued that Richard's death was never intended to be murder, that David had only meant to make him sick enough to delay his discovery of the financial irregularities. They even suggested that Claire had been the mastermind behind the scheme, that she'd manipulated David into helping her create a false inheritance claim by convincing him that Richard really was Danny's father. None of it worked. The jury saw through every attempt at misdirection and found David guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the fraud and embezzlement charges. When the verdict was read, David turned to look at me one last time. I don't know what he expected to see: forgiveness, satisfaction, some kind of closure that would make sense of everything that had happened. But I felt nothing for him at all. He'd become irrelevant to my life the moment he was locked away. Claire received a much lighter sentence, 5 years probation and community service in exchange for her full cooperation with the prosecution. The judge acknowledged that she'd been manipulated and desperate, that she'd never intended to participate in a murder scheme. But she'd still committed fraud and conspiracy, still helped someone try to steal from a grieving widow, still betrayed family trust in ways that couldn't be excused entirely. Our relationship didn't survive the trial. How could it? Every time I looked at her, I remembered sitting in her living room listening to her lie about Richard's supposed infidelity, watching her produce forged documents that would have stolen my home, seeing her perform grief and remorse that was completely fabricated. Maybe she really had been manipulated by David. Maybe her desperation had made her vulnerable to his schemes. But she'd still made choices, still decided that hurting me was acceptable if it solved her financial problems. The sister I'd thought I knew, the one who'd comforted me at Richard's funeral and promised to help me through my grief, had never really existed at all. But if you think this story ends with David in prison and my family destroyed, you'd be wrong. Because the most important part of what happened to me wasn't about revenge or justice or even survival. It was about discovering who I really was when everything familiar was stripped away. Richard's death had left me feeling completely adrift, like someone whose entire identity had been built around being half of a couple. For 27 years, I'd been Richard's wife, defined largely by that relationship and the life we'd built together. When he died, I'd assumed my story was essentially over, that I'd spend whatever years I had left managing grief and memories. But David's betrayal had forced me to find strengths I'd never needed before. Standing up to his manipulation, uncovering his lies, orchestrating his exposure, these weren't things the quiet librarian who'd buried her husband could have imagined doing. Yet somehow, when the situation demanded it, I'd been able to do all of it. The woman who'd sat in Claire's living room laughing at the absurdity of her sister's lies, who'd calmly set a trap for a murderer and recorded his confession, who'd stared down a killer and demanded the truth, that woman had been inside me all along, just waiting for circumstances that would require her to appear. Richard's life insurance and the recovery of the embezzled funds from David's schemes left me financially secure for the first time in my life. The house that David and Claire had tried to steal was completely mine, along with substantial assets I'd never expected to inherit. But more importantly, I discovered that I was capable of building a life that didn't depend on other people's definitions of who I should be. I sold the house on Maple Street 6 months after David's conviction. Too many painful memories lived in those rooms, too many ghosts of the life Richard and I had shared. Instead, I bought a smaller place closer to downtown, with a view of the river and room for the garden I'd always wanted but never had space for. I went back to work at the library, but only part-time. The rest of my time, I devoted to things I'd never had the freedom to explore: writing, traveling, volunteering with organizations that helped crime victims navigate the legal system. I started speaking at conferences for law enforcement officers, sharing what I'd learned about financial fraud and elder abuse schemes. My experience with David's manipulation had taught me to recognize patterns that other people might miss, signs of deception that victims often overlook because they trust the people who are lying to them. It turned out that my skills were in demand. Police departments and district attorneys' offices started consulting with me on complex fraud cases, asking me to help them understand how criminals build trust with their victims and identify weaknesses in elaborate deception schemes. Within 2 years, I'd started my own consulting business, helping families and law enforcement agencies investigate suspected financial crimes. The quiet librarian had become someone who specialized in exposing lies and protecting people from the kind of betrayal I'd experienced. I never remarried, never looked for someone to replace Richard in my life. But I discovered that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely, that building a life around your own interests and values could be just as fulfilling as building one around a relationship. On the 5th anniversary of Richard's death, I visited his grave for the first time since the day we'd buried him. I brought flowers, yellow roses, his favorites, and Richard's grandfather's ring, which the police had returned to me after David's conviction. I told him about the life I'd built since he'd been gone, about the work I was doing and the people I was helping. I told him about David's conviction and Claire's exile from my life, about the justice that couldn't bring him back, but at least ensured his killer would never hurt anyone else. Most importantly, I told him that I'd learned to be happy again, in ways neither of us had expected when we'd promised to love each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Some people might wonder if I ever regret not forgiving Claire, not trying to rebuild our relationship after the trial ended. The truth is, forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about accepting that some betrayals change you permanently, that some trust can never be rebuilt. I didn't need to forgive Claire to move on with my life. I just needed to accept that the sister I'd mourned losing had never really existed in the first place, and that discovering the truth about people's character is sometimes more valuable than maintaining comfortable illusions. David died in prison 3 years after his conviction, killed by another inmate in a dispute over gambling debts. When I heard the news, I felt nothing at all. No satisfaction, no closure, no sense that justice had been completed. He'd simply become irrelevant to my life, a problem that had been solved and forgotten. Claire tried to contact me several times over the years, sending letters apologizing for her role in David's scheme, asking if we could try to rebuild our relationship for the sake of family. I never responded. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, not because of hatred or an inability to forgive, but because there's simply nothing left worth reconstructing. As I'm recording this story today, I'm 68 years old and happier than I've been in decades. My consulting business is thriving, my garden is beautiful, and my life is completely my own in ways that feel both peaceful and exciting. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened to every twist and revelation, then you understand something important about betrayal and recovery that I wish I'd known years ago. The people who hurt you the most aren't always strangers or obvious enemies. Sometimes they're the ones closest to home, the ones you trust completely because you can't imagine they'd be capable of such cruelty. But surviving that kind of betrayal, exposing those lies, and building something better from the wreckage, that's where you discover who you really are underneath all the roles and relationships that used to define you. I wanted to comment below and let me know what part of this story resonated most with you. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was lying to you? Have you ever had to find strength you didn't know you possessed? Your stories matter, and sharing them helps other people realize they're not alone in facing these challenges. If this story helped you in any way, please subscribe to hear more about overcoming betrayal and building resilience. Share it with someone who might need to hear that survival is possible, that justice sometimes does prevail, and that the person you become after surviving betrayal might be stronger and more authentic than the person you were before. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about what happened to Richard, and to me, and to everyone whose lives were touched by David Morrison's greed and cruelty. Most of all, thank you for believing that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for, and that even the most devastating betrayals can't destroy you if you refuse to let them.